I'd like to very much introduce Professor Stephen Heppell. Stephen has been hailed internationally as an expert in online education and learning spaces. His vast portfolio of projects has established him as a leader in the fields of learning, new media, and technology. After his career as a school teacher, Stephen was a pioneer in the use of multimedia in the classroom, and he has worked on learner-led projects with governments, international agencies, Fortune 500 companies, schools, and communities. He also founded UltraLab, building it into one of the most respected research centers in e-learning in the world before founding his own policy and learning consultancy. Stephen's media experience includes international, national, and local broadcast and print. And so, Stephen, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks very much. And folk will need to go to speaker view. I think if you stop sharing your image there, I reckon if you go to speaker view so that I'm full and center on your screen, that's how we're going to do this. And I'm going to use the background behind me to display things really. So probably the first thing to say is just this, which is that there's a lot to cover in half an hour and 15 minutes of questions. So there's plenty more where that came from. I'm on Twitter, which I'm also monitoring today. And I have a website at heppell.net. 25 million people went to that website last year. So must be something going on there, and it's maybe worth a look. So I was loving watching you all check in on the chat just now, and you know, I've got projects all around the world, friends in lockdown Melbourne, as it was saying going past, in Saudi, lovely people in Saudi, in South America, working down in Lima at the moment. And it's interesting that my life around the world has become a life of zooming around the world rather than flying around the world, which is absolutely to my joy. So this is an extraordinary time. And I guess the one thing that's come straight away out of the COVID crisis everywhere has been people thinking again a little bit about their learning and thinking, how might we do that better? And so very much the focus of my talk, my brief talk today really is to talk about how we might optimize all that. And of course, a good question would be, well, where's all that come from, Stephen? Why have you started thinking about optimizing in so much detail? And I mean, plot spoiler, you know, spoiler alert, this stuff really works. You know, the improvement in behavior, in academic outcomes, in just joyfulness really and delight is pretty remarkable. So I'll take you on a bit of a little journey first of all, and I hope you're looking at me in speaker view full screen here, because you need to see me in the whole screen. And I'm lucky enough to work with sports all around the world. Some jolly interesting sports actually. I don't know what you care about. If you're interested in rugby, I work with the England rugby team. I work with the British Olympic team. I work with some soccer teams. You'll have probably heard of well, I'm a professor in Madrid, so of course Real Madrid is our local club. And one of the things you learn very quickly about working with sport is that they check on every single detail. They don't say that we've always done it like this, or we've always done it like that. They say, well, okay, that's what we used to do when the Olympics were in, I don't know, London, but now they're in Rio. Let's have a think about how we do it. And then when they're in Tokyo, let's think again. And every moment of every day, they're thinking, well, what can we do different? How can we do this better? And of course, I'm working with them because they're not very good at learning. You need to learn to be good at sport these days. There's so much to learn. I remember talking to Steve Backley, you know, a famous javelin thrower, world champion, Olympic medalist, multiple Olympics he went to, and he said with a wry smile, he said, when I used to throw the javelin, you know, he's a big lad. He said I used to just turn up and give my spear a mighty chuck. That's a good phrase, you know. And of course now, to be a javelin thrower, you need to know about material science, aerodynamics, nutrition, recovery, ice baths, some psychological stuff. Golly gosh, there's a lot to learn, and you still need to spend time training, probably more time training than ever before. So being good at learning is very important to them, and I can illustrate some of what that looks like here with this behind me is the and I'll just pop down a bit. I'm going to look, I'm peering over a wall, but you can see a little better if I just get out of shot a little bit. So this is the girls hockey team, and I know folk from India and elsewhere are hockey crazy, so you'll be interested in this for sure. And you'll see that the learning environment, which is just a very cheap demountable hut, you know, it's just a hut on the side of the playing field. But I mean, look at the detail of it. You'll see that the walls are all writable. You can write on every wall surface. I mean, not because it's cute to write on the walls, but because we know that when you write on the wall, it's a social activity and people remember the social moment of writing. If I take out my phone and take a picture of the wall, when I look at the picture some months on, I remember the very moment. Whereas if I just write it down in my notebook with my pen, you know, I don't really remember, and I don't even remember what day it was that I wrote all that down, you know. So the social activity of writing together, but also you'll see the girls here are sitting on tiered seating. This was before COVID, so they're all very close together, shoulder together. You can see how focused, absolutely focused they are on the problem that's been set, and you can see that the coach here, he's a man, and blokes do tend to interrupt a lot, so he's had to learn. This is a taught behaviour. He's learned to put his hands in his pocket so he doesn't keep interrupting and waving his arms about. He set a task and he stood back, and they're using the floor, so they've got avatar. Beg your pardon, a quick sip of milk. So they've got avatars on the floor. They use the table surface here. Even if they fly on a plane, you know, they have a little miniature hockey pitch they put out on the table on the plane. This is what efficient learning looks like, and we'll come on later to why the light is so bright in there and why the ventilation levels are so high. So what I learned from them, you know, short version of all this, what I learned from it, just resurface, hi and back. What I learned from them was that the aggregation of marginal gains looks at every single tiny detail. So in terms of the learning spaces that you're in, all around the world and everywhere is different. Every school is different. Every day is different. A windy day in a school, the children behave differently to a calm day, you know, and if something tragic happens, the school is a very different place for 2 terms. And, you know, so obviously there's a degree of agility. There's no one right way to do it. But let's start with movement, because sport is all about movement and they have to pause to do learning. We're all about learning, and historically maybe we did a little pause to do movement. So let's look at some facts really about movement. I'll probably start with this. This is a really nice image. So this is a functional MRI scan of a brain here and a brain here. In fact, they're aggregates of 20 brains, a lot of brains. And the students here have been asked to do a task. It's a standardized test. So they've just come into the room to do a test. And this group of students have been asked to do the test. They've been asked by their teacher, they sit down, take a moment, take a deep breath, collect your thoughts, calm, and now do the test. This group over here have come into the room and they're walking around the whole time. They keep moving. And then the minute the test starts, they sit down and start doing the test. And you can see the difference in the brain activity between the lot who sat down and collected their thoughts and the lot who just kept moving. I mean, it's very stark. And here's another set of data perhaps even more stark here, really, because this is measuring attention. The vertical axis here is attention, the horizontal axis is time. So what's happening here is that the group at the top here are moving a lot, and they're moving during their lessons. They're on the move the whole time. They have a sort of carousel activity where they spend some time doing collaboration, they spend some time doing research, they spend some time doing presentation, and they're moving around the room pretty much constantly. You know, every 10 minutes or so they move on, or every 15 minutes. The blue group here doing fairly short lessons, but they move between lessons. So every 40 minutes they get up and go down the corridor. And the worst group here is this lot, and they just stay in their seats pretty much the whole day. Obviously they move at break, or if they need to go to the toilet or for lunch, but pretty much they stay put the whole time. And you can see, I mean, starkly, that the group who don't move, their attention starts to fade away almost immediately and has really dropped badly by the end of the day here. Whereas the group who are on the carousel activities, they actually get more engaged as the day goes on, because the movement is particularly good for their brain. So we know straight away that the children moving is really important, and there are lots of ways we can engender that within the classroom, but fundamentally we want them to move. I mean, it's also worth saying that children sitting on a chair, you know, traditional school chair with a right angle back, many of you might be sitting on one right now, your blood goes from your head down to your hips, goes through a right angle out to your knees, another right angle, and down to your feet. And that's really not very good for the engagement of your brain, because basically the oxygen-rich blood doesn't get to your brain as well as it might. Children naturally try to slump. They lean back, they stretch their legs out, and they try and take that 90 degrees to being something like 130 degrees. So they go from two right angles to and schools will tell them, don't slouch, sit up straight, you know. But actually it's exactly the opposite. Slouching is really very good for your learning environment. And let's look at a couple of other examples of how they get children moving from around the world. This is in Yokohama, where the children play in a net above the classroom they're going to be joining later on. And that's pretty cool. Well, here we are in, and these are all pictures I took. I mean, there's lots more ways of doing all this. Here we are in TK Park in Thailand, where and this is a library, so to use the books, you have to climb up this climbing frame. And, you know, look, we've got boys reading, which in many parts of the world is quite a hard thing to achieve. And you'll notice there are sort of crash mats on the floor here. So if you do fall out, you don't know, you know, relatively few fatalities. And of course they have their shoes off, because that also helps your brain to work a little better. So movement is a powerful way to get learning working. But let's look at something else. Let's have a look at maybe CO2, because when I said the aggregation of marginal gains, I really meant it. Every little detail matters hugely. And I'm running a little box here that's measuring the humidity, the CO2. Here is CO2 is 879 parts per million. And when I came into the room, it was about 1,500 parts per million. And we know that your brain works less well, it's less optimal the minute you get above 1,000 parts per million. So let's look at a typical school day in a typical classroom and see if we can have a look at that data. And I've got one here. So again, I'll pop down a little bit so you can see. So this is Alder Grange School. This is not my data. This is Sean McDougall's data, but he's looked, and you can see that the day begins here. The children come in and they start breathing. I mean, you kind of want you want your children to breathe, so they start breathing, and very quickly the CO2 in the room goes up, because all the children of breathing. I think there were 27 children in the room here. The door is closed. By the time we get to break up here, the figures are looking pretty high, and the kids go out at break, so that CO2 drops a little bit, but it's a heavy gas. It just kind of hangs around there on the floor. And when the kids come back, it's still mostly in the room. They carry on breathing. We're up to lunch. And by lunchtime, you're up to 5,500 parts per million. So you'll be teaching a class, and often the children will be, struggling for attention as you get towards lunchtime. I've been into schools where they say, gosh, we must have lunch early because children can't survive for a whole morning of learning, and of course, it's not the children, it's the CO2 in the room. Now, what do we do about all that is really interesting. And one of the things we do is say to the children, look, you're gassing yourself with your own emissions. You're breathing out CO2, and everybody in the room is feeling a bit dopey. Those of you who have done exam invigilations will know that, you're only in the exam room about 20 minutes. You start falling asleep as an invigilator, you have to sort of stand up and walk around the room because that keeps you awake. The poor kids in their exam desks, don't get any better, and they struggle to stay focused for the whole of the exam. However, when we say to children, what do we do about this? It's really interesting because, architects would say, oh, get in filtering systems and, get in ventilator. Children say, I'll tell you what, they say, we've learned about photosynthesis, and we know that what plants do is absorb CO2 and produce oxygen. Well, they do in daylight. Transpiration at night is the other way around. That's why you don't have plants in your bedroom. But plants in the classroom, flipping brilliant. And then this gets to be really interesting because we're interested in the marginal gains, the little things. So it turns out that when we say to the children, bring a plant each, and if you go to heppell.net/BYOP, bring your own plant, you'll see all the details of this, but they bring a plant, they give their plant a name, and you think, well, how does a name help? Well, we were working in Islington with a group of children, and one of the plants we gave them was Aloe Vera. Here's an Aloe Vera plant. And there was a little lad there he was not a regular attender, to be honest. He had all sorts of issues at home. He was heroically looking after his mother as a carer and getting his siblings ready for school. So by the time he was ready for school, he'd had enough, so he was only in 2 or 3 days a week. We gave him an Aloe Vera for his plant. I have to say he was pretty unimpressed, It's like, oh, thanks, But it became his plant, and he came in and would go over and he'd say every morning, "Hello, Vera," which he thought was hilariously funny. Well, I think it's quite funny, actually, but I say the same to mine. I named mine Vera in his honor. "Hello, Vera." But the thing is, he's in charge of the plant. He does the nutrients in it. There's a whole lot of science here in measuring the thing. They build little Arduino boxes, hang them on the side of their flower pot to do self-watering. The plant becomes a part of a whole lot of other learning. But crucially, the plant reduces the CO2 in the room and just makes things a lot better. Now, I know watching you arrive, I saw that some of you are in the Emirates. So I've got a little example here from Dubai. This is, you can see here, this is Asha Alexander's work in one of the GEM schools in Dubai. But you can see here that the teachers have been doing a mini research project, and probably most importantly, you can see academic performance is up. Blue was before the plant wall. This is 1 plant per kid. They put a plant wall in. You can see afterwards. But for me, and if you're watching this in full screen view, which you should be, you'll see these numbers here are the subjective judgments by the teachers of children fidgeting less, children with less ADHD. We had kids there who had an attention deficit. There's actually nothing wrong with them. It was the room that was giving them the deficit. No, there was nothing wrong with them. You know, doctors would put them on Ritalin, but what they needed was a wall full of plants in their room. You know, didn't take so much. So what I'm saying is every little detail matters. And maybe let's go on to something else that's going to be pretty close to your heart. Let's talk about noise a little bit, because, you know, I taught for many years in East London and South London, and noise, getting the noise down was a real challenge. And one of the ways to make noise reduce is to put the children in charge of it. So instead of the teacher having to say, quieten down, class, you know, making more noise to try and diminish the noise, and you all have simple ways to do this, your hands in the air. But it's hard work. But in a lot of our schools, here's one in Islington, and in the school in Islington, these two children today are in charge of noise. And over here, there's a noise meter running. This is just an old tablet. It's not good for much anymore, but it's good for running a decibel meter. And kids know that if they can keep the noise out of the orange bit all morning, as a class, they'll go to lunch a little earlier, you know, 2 or 3 minutes earlier, get to the front of the lunch queue. It's a real reward. In Bondi Beach Primary School, and I was watching this from Australia, but in Bondi Beach Primary School, the canteen was the noisiest room. It was just deafeningly noisy, because you got thermoplastic floors, you've got hard ceilings, you got the sound being reflected backwards and forwards. You know, shocking. So what they did there was put a noise meter in the serving hatch, and if the noise went too high, they turned the price of the menu round, and the price of the food went up. So if the room became too noisy, the price of custard doubled. And you won't be surprised to hear that, of course, you know, the children could control their own noise. The minute they saw a hand going up to turn the price around, the room went really quiet. Of course it did. So giving the children agency over all this is really important. And we've learned some important lessons from all that. And there's one here that I think is just fascinating. This is a classroom in Barcelona where we asked the children to make over their classroom by remanufacturing it in cardboard. And we'd done this before. This is a classroom in Madrid where the kids made the whole thing in cardboard, and then we manufactured it for them. But this one was interesting because the children were getting on with their learning in their cardboard classroom with the new look learning space. And if you look up here on the wall, they've got an interactive whiteboard here, but it's a cardboard interactive whiteboard. It doesn't work. And they've got a stage here, and it's all just made out of, you know, bits of paper and bits of rubbish. Right at the back there, there's a little 3-sided space. That's the head teacher there. Just behind him, there's a 3-sided space, because children like to learn in 3-sided spaces. And that's all made from chicken wire and brown paper. Now, what's interesting about this space is that it was better. The behavior was better, the engagement was better, the children were proud of it. There's a sign on the door that says classroom of tomorrow, under construction. And of course, it's never going to be finished because they're always constructing it. But how is it possible that children in a classroom that's mostly made of cardboard and chicken wire are learning better than in the classroom they were in before? And of course, the answer is easy for teachers, because you know that children love role play, and these children were role playing what will it be like to be in the classroom of the future. And they didn't need to be in the classroom of the future, they just needed props so they could imagine the classroom of the future, which was a collaborative space, a more challenging space, an engaging space, and a space where they had movement, and a space with great ventilation. So fascinating stuff. You know, we learned tons and tons and tons from the importance of agency in all this. And I'm just keeping an eye on the clock here. We have 5 minutes left, and then we're into questions. So it's worth picking up a couple of other little details. This is one. This is thinking about what's the best food for your brain. Now in sport, we know exactly what food to eat on the morning of an Olympic final, what to eat for the 4 years before, you know, what will I be eating now for Tokyo next year? And we did the same thing here with a group of children. We did a literature search, and we found that there were some foods that were particularly good for cognitive processes. We found that, for example, nuts and eggs were good. We found that turmeric was good. We found that olive oil was good. So here we got turmeric, berries, and then we asked the children to turn those into recipes, which they did, and they produced some really delicious recipes. This book is free, and if you follow me on Twitter, I'll tweet the recipe, I'll tweet the booklet location. You can go and download it yourself. It's a great little booklet. But the really interesting thing was that because the children were thinking about every detail, every forkful of lunch that I put in my mouth impacts on my learning, their learning changed. They became more metacognitive. They became more reflective practitioners. It wasn't just them. The team in the canteen who, you know, were just putting food on plates every day were fascinated by the project because it's a research project. And they became researchers. They turned up to the meetings with notes. They'd been Googling, they'd done a lot of research themselves. They couldn't wait to serve food that was better for the brains of their children. And of course, you know, on top of all that, it was good for their brains, and they did do better learning, and they did become smarter. But for me, the excitement here was to see them change from being just students to being researchers of their own activity and their own progress. So just a couple more things to go into. One is every detail in your learning space needs to bring the children's eyes back to learning. Look, here's a simple example of a door that's got a protractor on the floor. So when I open the door, I say to the children, "Oh, can you just open the door, 30 degrees?" Or here's a clock, and the times on the clock are mathematical problems. If you go into Mark Oliphant College in South Australia, every room number is a maths problem. There is no room 9, but there's a room that's the square root of 81. So, you know, really big thing of this detail is wherever your learner's eyes go, they will be led back always to learning in some form or other. And I think if I just contrast that for a moment with some of the hideous things that have happened under COVID, this is a primary school in France, and I think I can't look at this picture without crying. I mean, I feel myself welling up now. Those are children sat down there in those little squares, you know, and it just seems to me that we've had a chance really with COVID to think again and to think afresh about all the ways that we manage this learning, and you know, we can see some dramatic results, some proper improvements when we really start looking at the details. Here's just a reminder as we go to questions of my Twitter feed and my website. So I think we're going to go over to the questions now, Eric, and we could talk about this stuff probably for a fortnight without taking breath, but let's see what people want to know about and go off down that route.
Thank you very much, Stephen. There was a very, very active discussion going on, and I have to say some of it perhaps split. So I'll get on to one or two, wouldn't say contentious, but I think good conversation starters. First, a very practical question. Leonard Lifgreen asks, is all of this on movement and CO2 levels applicable to adult learners as well?
Yeah, yes, it is 100%. And basically, this is just physiology. You know, you've got one heart and one brain, and you've got a pair of feet, you know, and your heart has to send blood to your feet before it gets to your brain. And it's, you know, if you can make the body active, it moves around a lot, and that really works. I mean, I would say that, you know, if you look at, well, let's take Real Madrid as an example. You know, the last few years, they've been very poor at set pieces. They've got some brilliant players on the pitch. some hugely talented players. Whenever there's a set piece, it usually goes wrong. And the reason is in their classrooms, which are just a bunch of people sitting at a desk looking at a whiteboard with magnetic pieces on it. And you watch that over the next 2 or 3 years as that changes. I mean, the data is remarkable. Liverpool Football Club have 11 full-time data scientists just looking at the data of people moving around the pitch. And the head of data in Liverpool Football Club has a PhD in theoretical physics, you know, so people are really looking at all this with adults and children and very young children. It's absolutely applicable. It's probably applicable to horses for all I know, but it certainly applies to people, whatever their age, yeah.
Okay, super. Thank you. Then we had a number of comments and questions around the whole movement piece, especially at the moment in lockdown or in schools or countries where there's still lockdown. How can you integrate this whole notion of getting students, getting learners to be active when they're studying online from home?
Yes, very good. And the same rules apply at home. I mean, interestingly enough, and we've been running our little these things are called Learnometers. You go to learnometer.net, you can read the research project. But we've been putting these into home learning spaces as well. And we're quite alarmed at what we've seen, because typically in a house, the children are often doing homework upstairs because downstairs is noisy. So the heat rises, so the rooms are too hot. The windows are shut, the CO2 is high. The light levels are very low. And if you look at the room that I'm in at the moment, you can see how bright the walls look. I have no lights in this room at all. This is a high refractive paint, so the paint surfaces in the room reflect paint really well. And it's very easy to just redecorate and change the room around a little bit to make it optimal for learning. And we found that children that were struggling to complete home tasks, school tasks at home, we found the completion rates more than doubled when you get the room, when you optimize the room. But I would also say that you know, kids all sitting in a row in school is not the best way to learn. Kids all sitting at a desk at home is not the best way to learn. And movement and collaboration and sharing, you know, works really well. So kids might be at home, but I mean, we're living in a world that's, we're talking today from all over the world, but talking to people who are on my line of latitude is a very different task to talking to people who are on my line of longitude. On my line of longitude, you know, I'm living in England, and I might well be saying, hey, Johannesburg, what are you having for lunch? Because we have lunch roughly the same time. Or I might pick up a project, pass it on to say the West Coast of America, or maybe the East Coast and the West Coast, and out to Hawaii, maybe round the back to Japan, India, Eastern Europe, and home. So by the time I get up in the morning, my project's gone around 5 or 6 different schools. Those are very different models of working. And I think one of the things we've learned very quickly is that children learning at home are part of a global classroom rather than being one kid in an individual classroom. So setting tasks for the children that expect them to collaborate around the world, that ask them, I mean, many of you are language teachers, you know, getting the kids to log on and talk to other children with other languages is just absolutely the simplest thing to do. So, you know, don't think of them as sitting in a little box at home. Think of them as sitting in a little research project, and the research project is how to do this better. But actually, if you go to my website, heppell.net, there's a whole section there on optimizing your home space, and it's there in English and Spanish. Buenos dias.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. Then this is where it not so much gets contentious, but I think we're coming to a bit of a nub of the thing here. So we had various people saying, asking like, basically, all very well and good, but how am I supposed to do this in a 3x3 square meters classroom and 35 students inside? Rose asks, do you have concrete advice for those overcrowded classrooms in public schools in Latin American countries? And then here's what I think is possibly the crux of the matter. How do we get governments to change their approach to education and move away from test-driven outcomes? That's really the fundamental question, isn't it?
Well, it sort of is, but I mean, I'll come back to that briefly in a minute. But But I would say that, you know, if you take the Olympics as our model, some of the things we're expected to do in the Olympics are downright silly. You know, 10,000 meters walking is comical. I mean, it's hard to watch the event without laughing, or you know, synchronized trampolining or whatever. However, given we're stuck with these silly tasks, the first thing we might do is see how good we can be at them anyway. And one of the really good news about all this is that when we make the learning space as good as we can make it, the tasks that we thought were inappropriate and difficult are still inappropriate, but they're a damn sight easier because the children's brains are working better and they're more engaged. So, yeah, I mean, ministers, in the last 2 months, I've talked to over 103 ministers of education from around the world and all their senior policymakers. And, you know, I don't really have a collective noun for them. A muddle of ministers perhaps would be the best thing. But the change here is coming from the bottom up. The change is children in their classrooms saying, you know what, we want to do things differently. You know what, I want to hit my personal best in learning, just like every athlete wants to hit a PB. And I should say most of my work is in state schools, overcrowded schools, poor schools. You don't need to spend a lot of money to make this better. Saying to every kid, bring in a plant, you know, they can dig one up on the way in and put it in a flower pot. You know, it's not so hard, all this. And the difference is extraordinary. Let's take lighting for a minute. A lot of you will be in classrooms with those bad old fluorescent tubes. The fluorescent tubes flicker. They're very yellow light. It's not very good for your brain. If you're a teacher, I guarantee you'll be feeling ill by Friday afternoon and you will have a headache at least once a week. That's the lighting. But if we take those tubes out, we can retrofit LED bulbs now, and they go straight into the same fitting. But you need them to be the whitest, purest light you can get. You don't want blue light or yellow light, you want pure white light, which if you're a bit geeky, you're looking for a Kelvin value of 5,500 or higher. When you have that bright light, you get bright minds. And, you know, even when you've got 40 or 50, and I mean, some of the places, and you're saying you've got a lot of kids at 30, there's places out there with a hell of a lot more than that, over 100 in many classes in parts of Africa. However, getting the environment right still makes it the best it could possibly be. And you know what? You put in those LED bulbs, they pay for themselves in 3 years because they use a lot less electricity. And so every time a bulb goes, throw away the useless old tube, put in an LED one, only a little bit more money for the tube, and it'll pay for itself. You don't have to do the whole school at once. Just every time a bulb goes, replace that and maybe one other, and you'll get there in 3 years anyway. So all this is easy. This is all about detail, but I can't stress too much. The most important thing here is saying to the children, hey guys, you're in charge. You know, you give us a view, you tell me what you think's work, you manage noise, you look after it. And that's the big difference. And if I look at track and field athletes from most countries in the world these days, I can't tell you the difference between the athlete and the coach. They're all sitting around data, they're looking at numbers, they're thinking, how can we do this better? You know, if you're going to put a clock in with puzzle numbers on it, you don't do it yourself, you just put in a clock with 12 round black squares, and you give the kids a white crayon and say, think of a puzzle. And you'll see, if you look at that one, you'll see they thought, you know, pi divided by, that's actually not quite 3, is it? It's 3 point jolly nearly 3 o'clock, you know. But think of a puzzle, you know, and if they do it, then they feel ownership and agency for that. Changes everything. It really does change it. And another silly thing about a movement, just since that's come up again, I mean, you know, these are schools around the world where they put slides in. You know, going to schools where they've got huge overcrowding on the staircase, a lot of jostling going on. And I say, look, why don't you just put a slide in? And I'll tell you what, kids love to come down from the first floor in a slide, you know, and this is a slide I designed. This is one in my house where I live. This is one in a school. This is one in a school. And you think, well, that's a bit crazy, Stephen. But if I go in to every Google office in the world, they've all got a slide in. And they haven't got a slide in because it's good fun. They've got a slide in because it's good for their brains. And people who work for Google need to be smart. So, you know, we learn from everybody else and they learn from us here. None of this costs a lot of money. It's just a bit of plastic tubing and a lot of fun.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think we've got time for one last question. There's one that I love because it's come up a few times. Very practical. Various people have said how they like your, how you've done the slides effectively behind you. How do you do that in Zoom? Very practical.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's I really like it because if you have to sort of go across the PowerPoint and me over here. So in Zoom, if you go up to preferences up in the top corner of your screen, you pull down preferences and you'll see a thing there that allows you to change the settings. It says general and there's a video setting, and one of the settings is background and filters. And if you choose background and filters, you can then add pictures to the background and just keep clicking on them and they just appear and they change. And, you know, so if we were talking about, say, the practicalities of schools in COVID, and I was saying how important it is to have lids on the toilets and shut the toilet lids, yeah, well, you're doing the same, you know. So you can, but you can just step through them very quickly indeed, and you just have to be a bit aware. And if I want to sink down, I just move the screen on my laptop up and down, and I go up and down. It's very simple stuff, all this. And yeah, and I learned it, of course, from watching kids use Zoom, because that's what we do, isn't it, really? Listen, I'm going to say one last closing thing, because it just matters by way of summary, really. That is, we're very lucky to have the schools we've got. And one of the things I think we've become complacent about is how good children might be. We've seen, I think, during COVID, this is my 6-year-old granddaughter who spent most of the lockdown sailing a boat. I mean, she's now at 6, she's a phenomenal sailor, got all her external accredits and certificates and things. And I think people talk a lot about how can children catch up when they get back into school. For me, it's much more how can schools catch up with what the children have done and build on the many things that they've done. And I know some of the things they've done have been about ingenuity and about curiosity and about playfulness. And I think we have got a lot to learn from the things that they've enjoyed from being out of school. And I know a lot of you already are in a conversation with them about what are you going to miss when you come back. And I was talking to a group of kids in Scotland just the other day, and I asked them, you know, how many days per week do you need to come into school physically to still feel part of the community, part of your friends, part of your mates? And a lot of kids, not as many as there are of you, I said, hold your hand up and show me how many days a week you need to come. And the average was 2. On average, they thought 2 days a week would be enough. So I'm looking around, there's a chicken just come in the room, which is rather nice, you know, as they do. But the kids said 2 days a week will be enough. And so, you know, that's really interesting for the places where the classrooms are overcrowded. I'm trying to do a thing in the Philippines of building a radio station for every village, where the village becomes a radio station and the broadcast station. And I think, you know, there's a whole lot of other ways we can do learning. Schools are important, but schools aren't all of it anymore. And that takes the pressure off and makes the learning more exciting. So I'll leave you with that thought. 2 days a week, what are you going to do with the other 3, eh?
Super. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was very enjoyable. Lots of really good comments as well in the chat window. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. And yeah, we've got Stephen's website address and Twitter handle. Some of you asked for them in the chat window, so there we go. And thank you all for joining, and hope to see you in another session or more over the next couple of 2 or 3 days. And thank you again, Stephen. That was very enjoyable. Thanks very much.
I'm having the time of my life, to be honest.
Good stuff.
Goodbye, everybody. I'll just put the Twitter handle in the chat window as well while I'm there.
Okay, super. Thanks all. Bye.